Today we're sewing up a suit jacket with a notched collar and a curved bottom hem. This is Simplicity 8178. It's an unlined jacket which makes it great for beginners or anyone who's looking to save a little bit of time, fuss, and calculation. I've sewn this jacket once before as part of a set using Simplicity 1370 from the skirt, which is also a sew-along available on this channel. The tweed boucle that I used for that set is from Rex Fabrics. For that set, I lined the skirt and I underlined the jacket, and I shared the process for both in 2 separate shorts on this channel. I'll link those short videos in the description below. The fabric that I'm using in today's video is an ivory silk wool blend from Rex Fabrics. I would love for you to experience the high quality materials available at Rex Fabrics, so today's giveaway is 3 yards of this very same fabric. If you'd like to enter the giveaway, stay tuned to the end of the video for more details. For now, let's sew this jacket. For your front and undercollar pattern piece, you have a dot on the inside edge of the V that indicates the top of the dart as well as where we're going to be doing some stay stitching. Mark the placement of that dot onto the wrong side of the fabric. Then we're going to stay stitch through that dot with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, starting 1/2 inch above the dot and ending our stitching 1/2 inch below the dot. Do this for both pieces. Then using sharp scissors, we'll clip through the seam allowance to the stitching line and not beyond. Do that for both front pieces. Now using a tracing wheel and tracing paper, I'm going to transfer the dart on the front and undercollar piece onto the wrong side of the fabric. For both pieces. Then we can fold the dart in half and pin through one dart leg and out the other. Then we'll sew from the top of the stitching line from the dot transferred from the pattern piece to the point of the dart, leaving thread tails at the end so you can tie them in knots. Now I'm going to do some finishing stitches along the top of the front and undercollar piece. I want to finish that inner edge of the dart, and the clipping that we made to the dot earlier will allow me to finish the raw edge of that dart without disrupting the dart. I'm also going to finish that shoulder edge, as well as this angled edge of the back neck and back collar. Do this for both front and undercollar pieces. And then we can press our darts toward the center front. Here are my 2 back jacket pieces. I'm going to take them to my serger and finish the raw edges of the center backs separately for both pieces. Now that those center back edges are finished, I'll place my back pieces right sides together and pin the center back seam. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Now I'll place my front and undercollar pieces right sides together along the topmost edge, and then pin this top undercollar edge together. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. I've gone ahead and finished the shoulder edges of my back bodice piece. Now we can place the front and back pieces right sides together along the top edge, and we're going to pin the shoulders and the neckline. Now we're going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from one outer edge to the small dot that we clipped into earlier, back stitching to secure. Then we'll move that dart out of the way so we can place our needle at the small dot on the opposite side, starting our stitching, once again back stitching to secure to stitch all around the neckline. And then back stitch to secure those stitches, move that dart out of the way once again to start a fresh set of stitches, and continue to the other side of the garment with that 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press those shoulder seams open and press the neckline seam up toward the undercollar. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of both of your front-facing pieces. Then at the inner corners of both pieces, we're going to do stay stitching just as we did for the front bodice piece. I'm going to transfer the dot from my pattern piece using chalk. Then we're going to stitch through that dot, starting a 1/2 inch above the dot, pivoting at the dot, and then ending the stitching a 1/2 inch away from the dot on the opposite side of the corner. Doing that for both pieces. Then we'll clip to those dots, careful not to clip through the stitching line. Now I'll place these facing pieces right sides together along the topmost edge and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. For the inner curved edges of the facing, I've chosen to go ahead and finish those edges using my serger for both inner curves. For this back neck section, I'm going to fold the raw edge to the wrong side by 5/8 inch and give that a press. To prepare for sewing the notched collar, I'm going to transfer the stitching line from my front and under collar piece onto the mirror curved edge of the facing piece. Repeating that for both facings. Now I'll place the facing and the jacket right sides together along the outer edges and pin in place, first matching the center back edges and then continuing down the center fronts. Then we'll start sewing at the bottom edge, starting at the dot transferred from your pattern piece with a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way up the outer curve until we get to the transferred lines of our notched collar. We're going to follow that stitching line, pivoting at that triangle, and then continue at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Repeating for the other side of the notched collar as well. Now we're going to cut away the excess fabric inside that triangle. I'm also going to clip into the very tip of the triangle, careful not to clip through the stitching line. And do the same for the other side. For the rest of the seam allowances, I'm going to trim them by about half. And also clip into those curves. Now we can turn this facing to the inside of the garment, poking out the corners of the notched collar, Now for the neckline, I'm going to fold back that portion that we pressed earlier of the facing by 5/8 of an inch and place that now folded edge over the neckline stitching line. Pin from the outside of the garment. Then stitching from the outside of the garment, I'm going to stitch in the ditch of that neckline seam, catching that folded edge of the neckline facing as I go. We're stitching from dot to dot. Now that that collar edge is done, I'm going to take the shoulder seam of the facing and fold it back by 5/8 of an inch and place it right over the shoulder seam of the jacket. Then using a needle and thread, I'm going to slip stitch that edge in place, doing that for both shoulder seams. Sewing the folded edge of the facing to the seam allowance, not allowing the needle to exit the front of the garment so that the stitches are invisible from the outside of the garment. For my back bodice piece, I've gone ahead and finished the bottommost raw edges. And I've also finished both of the back side seams and the side seams of the front pieces as well. Now I'll place my front and back pieces right sides together and pin the side seams from the underarm seam to the bottom of the facing with that facing opened out flat. Doing this for both side seams. Sew both side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now I'm going to fold up the bottom hem of the jacket to the wrong side by 1.5 inches, from side seam to side seam. Then I'm going to fold this hem to the right side so that the finished edge of my hem peeks over that bottom fold by 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to use a blind hem stitch to stitch from side seam to side seam. Alternatively, you could use a needle and thread to do a blind hem as well. The blind hem created a series of zigzag stitches along my finished edges and a series of single stitches along the exterior fabric, creating a virtually invisible hem. Then for the front outer edges, we're going to top stitch along the outer edges starting at one side seam, pivoting around the notched collars, continuing along the top of the garment, pivoting once again, to end our stitching at the opposite side seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For the bottom edges of both of my sleeves, I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges and pressed them to the wrong side by 1.25 inches. To prepare for inserting the sleeves, we're going to sew basting stitches along the sleeve cap, from one single notch to the double notch, leaving thread tails on both sides so we have threads to pull for easing. Do this for both sleeves. I've gone ahead and finished the underarm edges for both sleeves separately. Now with the bottom hem folded out for now, fold each sleeve in half right sides together with itself, and pin the underarm edges. Sew each seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. It will be easier for us to hem the sleeves now before they're attached to the jacket. I'm going to fold the bottom edge of the sleeve to the wrong side along my pre-pressed crease. And then just as we did for the bottom of the back of the jacket, I'm going to fold this hem temporarily to the right side, allowing a 1/4 inch of the finished edge to peek beyond the fold and pin in place. Using my blind hem foot once again, I'll sew a blind hem all around the bottom of both sleeves. Now with your sleeve right side out and your bodice wrong side out, place the sleeve into its corresponding armhole. Match the underarm seams and pin in place, and then continue pinning on both sides of the underarm seam to the notches. Also match the dot at the top of the sleeve cap with your shoulder seam and pin in place. Then we can start pulling our basting stitches so that the sleeve fits from the notch to the shoulder seam on both sides. Remember that we're not trying to form gathers here, so all the gathering that happens needs to happen within the seam allowance and not beyond. Once it fits, pin in place. Repeat the process on the other side to pin the entire sleeve in place. Then we can sew the sleeve into the armhole with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. Repeat to insert both sleeves and your jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. If you're interested in entering the giveaway for 3 yards of ivory silk wool from Rex Fabrics, you can check out the fabric in the link in the description box below and let me know what sewing project or specific pattern you have in mind for this fabric. This giveaway will be open from today, February 25th, 2024 at 3 p.m. Eastern, and it will run through next Sunday, March 3rd, 2024 at 3 p.m. Eastern. The winner will be randomly selected and announced in a So Happy community post, as well as in the description box below. This giveaway is not sponsored by YouTube, and So Happy is solely responsible for choosing the winner and giving out the prize. I hope you enter, and I'll see you in the next video.